Well, I think a good life is about health and wellness of the body, mind, and spirit. And that has all kinds of implications related to a sense of empathy and interconnectedness with all living creatures.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick Rodell. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Wahinkpe Topa, Lakota for 4 Hours, also known by his Irish name Don Trent Jacobs. 4 Hours has doctorates in health psychology and in curriculum and instruction. Author of many books, chapters, articles, and peer-reviewed papers, endorsed by such notables as Vandana Shiva, Noam Chomsky, John Pilger, Sam Keen, and many more. His most recent article, published in the General Psychology Review, is about restoring sanity and decolonizing Western psychology. 4 Arrows is a world champion old-time piano player, an Olympic class equestrian, a paddleboard surfer. Wow. And this just scratches the surface. 4 Arrows, how are you?
Well, I'm doing just fine. I'm just doing fine. I'm in Southern Oregon near Ashland and Talent right now, and just getting ready to head to Ireland in a few days. So doing well.
That's awesome. You have a pretty interesting story there. I think just even in that short bio, it says a lot. Piano player, paddleboard surfer. I love it. Very, um, a broad range of activities that you've done in your life, and I'm assuming that you are continuing to do.
My
Um,
little girl, I remember when she was 6. She's 49 now, and now and a topic of a movie because of her just having released with her school called Ditch School, is a counter-hegemonic school. The kids worked on the murder books of two African American
hmm.
males put into prison by a Los Angeles district attorney, and her class got evidence working with a Innocence Project lawyer. And just Google it. It was on the front page of the New York Times. The producer of Aaron Brockovich is doing a movie on her class.
Oh, wow.
He uh, um, they're both released and exonerated after 20 and 27 years in prison.
Hmm.
It's a great story, So
Yeah.
I had to get that plug in. But I remember when she was 6 years old, people used to ask her, "What does your dad do?" And even back then, she just shrugged her shoulders. She just does everything, right? So I've got a kind of a really, I guess, a jack of all trades and maybe a master of none. So, but
I
I
love
just
that.
really, I love life and all the dimensions that it holds, and I'm involved with a lot of things.
That's awesome. You have range, as they say. So, speaking of which, I know I gave that introduction, and you just said a little bit there. Can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, and yeah, how you like to
Sure.
to
Well, if I
share.
was saying it in Lakota, I'd say Wahinkpe Topa amachiapelo, meshante tawo wogala ke not na pechuze pelo. My name is 4 Arrows, and I speak from my heart here today, and I offer you and the audience a warm handshake. Is pretty much what I said. And yes, I'm a professor at Antioch University, formerly with Fielding University, and then before that, Northern Arizona, and before that, Dean of Education at Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm a pipe carrier. I've fulfilled my Sundance vows with medicine horse Tioshpe. And my passion, really is now the research around non-dualistic, non-binary worldview reflection between the pre-colonial and the post-colonial worldview that emerged around 8,000 years ago, and getting us back to, we're out of balance on on a big scale, as most people looking around can tell. And yet, the foundational worldview precepts that we all practiced, if we go back 8 or 9 thousand years, that we can call indigenous worldview precepts. In my most recent book, I call it Kinship, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. But in any case, that's my work, and I have doctoral students that are engaged with that kind of reflection also.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That sounds great. I'm hoping that well, I'm sure those ideas are going to be unpacked
I'm
as
sure
we.
too. Yeah, that's everything I'm about right now is, traveling around. I spoke at the United Nations. They invited me in September to speak on it. So it's really starting to get recognition after me being doing it for 4 decades. Just the last 2 or 3 years, people are starting to see, wow, it's the foundational worldview that is we've lost and replaced with one that's separated from nature, and as a result of that is got us in the consequences that we're looking at.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I totally agree. Um, I like to ask in the beginning, and again, I think that after this question, some of the ideas about your background and what's influenced and shaped this perspective is going to come out. But so, what is your perspective on what it means to live well or the good life? What does that mean for you? What is your philosophy on that?
Well, I think a good life is about health and wellness of the body, mind, and spirit. And that has all kinds of implications related to a sense of empathy and interconnectedness with all living creatures. Now, again, I'm speaking from that worldview perspective that we just talked about, that guided humanity for 99% of human history. There's a lot of evidence that is contrary to what most of us learn in school about and I've written a lot about my University of Texas book called Unlearning the Language of Conquest. Scholars expose anti-Indianism in America. Really refers to top scholars from Oxford and UCLA saying the primitive past of indigenous peoples of Africa or of the Americas or wherever. It's a good thing that we have centralized. That's really still what's taught in many schools and in many popular things. So but the happiness factor, Dr. Braccio wrote an article in that, or a chapter in that book, and it was all on happiness and giving some good evidence of how happy we lived. And today on our website, provensustainable.org, we have, I think, 22 examples of cultures that have held on or regained these ways of living. And so the happiness is there, and the sustainability. The United Nations largest study ever done showed that where indigenous worldview was operating, the biodiversity loss that is so staggering everywhere else doesn't exist. And even on indigenous reservations, which were prison of war camps originally, where there is poverty and where there is tragedy and alcoholism and that, if you're with the population that is holding on, to their old ways, it's just, you don't leave a place without feeling love and happiness and generosity, because it's part of that worldview of recognizing everything is connected. So I guess the simplest answer is to say that that the spirit, body, mind, health that I mentioned comes from really a sacred recognition that we are all interconnected, and that everything is full of has spirit, has soul, and that includes trees and ants and birds as well as humans.
That's just so beautiful. Yeah, this I think that we've gotten to this place where we've isolated ourselves, and when we separate ourselves, that causes suffering.
Yeah, we've put
And
ourselves above nature.
mhm,
How can you be happy and healthy?
yeah,
Definitions in dictionaries. If you look up nature, it says everything but humans and what humans make, essentially. And
yeah,
as long as we have that perspective and that ego and that arrogance, then ultimately our hierarchy, our not understanding diversity, leads to oppressive ways of being in the world with one another.
yeah,
I mean, somebody was just mentioning to me something about the sun where I'm going in Mexico, where I just came from, and whether we're going to have sun where I'm going on the west coast of Vancouver Island, because here in Oregon right now the sun's just coming out, and we were talking about I had terminal cancer a while back, and I'm cancer free now, and I use mostly natural ways, but vitamin D I found was a very important thing, and and the conversation went on into racism because it was one of my students doing a doctorate on counter hegemonic racism and stuff like that. And what we talked about is, the most amazing thing to me is that people don't realize that skin color is the most magical, basic way to assure that we get vitamin D without negative consequences. I mean, that's the whole reason for it, right?
right,
And it's like, how do we get into these hierarchies? And with them, happiness always fades in one way or the other, even for the racist, even for the person that doesn't like another way of being. Uh, so until we can really recognize this, we are all spirits. We are
yeah,
all in these unique containers that are, that we've chosen essentially, and that interconnectedness is also symbiotic.
yeah,
And if we could just get that, then the humor, I don't think I've ever left an anipi ceremony. That other people think, know that as probably as a sweat house, which is a traditional way that many of the Plains Indians did ceremony. It's one of the 7 sacred ceremonies of the Lakota, and and oftentimes they're for healing. Oftentimes they're about tragic situations, the disappearing of a woman or a death of someone or someone very sick. But I've never left a lodge without my stomach being a little sore from laughing. That humor is brought into it, no matter how dire, how bad. Humor is brought into it in a beautiful way, and this is just part of the reflection of when we recognize that everything is related. Then we can find that happiness. Now, in an indigenous worldview, which I told you I keep coming back to, it sees opposites as potentially complementary, and that's why this union of opposites has happened. So that's it's not an either or thing in terms of ultimately they connect. And in an example of, I mean, the sun and the moon stories, Monster Slayer, for example, in the Navajo story, Monster Slayer is the solar twin, very strong, very powerful. But his twin brother is called Child Born of the Water, who's much more passive and reflective, right? But in all the indigenous mythologies, these two go to fight the monsters. And what are the monsters? The monsters are those things that we all have had, and indigenous people always knew about them. Our ancestors always knew about them. Greed, jealousy, envy, those kinds of things are the monsters. So in this Navajo story, Monster Slayer and Child Born of the Water, the twins, they go to fight this monster. I think it was the monster of greed. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But he was the monster with the long arms. And Monster Slayer says, I'm going to get him. So he takes his bow and he starts to shoot. Child Born of the Water says, no, no, no. He'll get that arrow before it gets to him because his arms are so long. So he says, well, why he withdraws the string. And he says, well, what do you think we should do? And Child Born of the Water says, I think we should sing to him. So they do. And the monster, never having been treated that way, lets them pass. Well, now jump forward to about 5000 BC. These same twin hero stories, somewhere along the line, a couple of, let's say you and I were a couple of indigenous guys back then, but we happened to be in a situation where we recognized our special, unique power of maybe the place and the water and the food we had in a certain situation. And we decided to become greedy. Maybe we decided to be in power. Something like that must have happened around 9000 BC, and Turkey is the area where we know it happened, but we don't know how it happened. But let's say that's how it happened. And then we say, wow, let's be kings, and we'll create this. Well, that's what happened, right? And so it's in that potential of anyone. Well, and this when it did happen, the mythology changed.
Yeah.
From twin hero myths. They still had them, but now the solar twin kills the lunar twin. Romulus Remus, Cain and Abel, Jacob Esau, Hercules. Everybody knows Hercules, the solar twin, but his twin brother was equally powerful, named Iphicles. We don't know about him. So we're out of balance, right? Like left and right brain. So I think happiness and a good life, it comes from this deep understanding of interconnectedness, and I hope we can emphasize that not too much throughout the time.
Yeah, I'm so with you. I teach anatomy and physiology at a community college here, and in the analogy that you made, you brought up cancer. You have these trillions of cells in our bodies, and I'm not even talking about the biota, the rest of the little microorganisms that are also part of who we are, and then they outnumber us. They outnumber the
Right?
number of
They're
cells that we
probably
have.
more powerful than our brain, right?
Exactly, and so all these trillions of cells have to cooperate. And if those cells don't cooperate, then the organism can't function well. It can't function effectively. You can't have those biochemical reactions, metabolism, to make sure that the organism survives and
Well,
is tightly regulated.
that's what happened to me. I knew that I was taking on too many projects, writing too many books, and bingo, I get this huge tumor, 11 centimeters. And they said, we got to do surgery, we got to do chemotherapy. And I went into my Inipi ceremony lodge, and I came out smiling. And of course, my poor wife is, when you get that kind of thing. And it was stage 4.
Mm.
And so I said, look, I think I can get this done with what I call the big 7. Vitamin D from the sun. I live it in Mexico on the beach. Fearlessness of dying. Um, Eating no additional processed or sugary foods.
Mm-hmm.
Exercising twice a day. Those kinds of things, right? And meditation, self hypnosis, with all of those things, it disappeared. And this was in 2008, and I stayed in remission from 2008 until 2021, and it came back aggressively. And why did it? Because I did just what you're saying. I got out of balance again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I knew it. And this time it was too late. I knew for me to do what I did. So I went to MD Anderson, had 2 chemo sessions, continued all those 7 things again, though. And on the third one, he says, this is amazing. You've had stage 4 B-cell lymphoma coming back, which usually it doesn't, the second time. And he says, it's done. You don't have any cancer. And I said, but I want to do a third one. And I said, oh no, I already lost my hair, right?
Right.
Yeah. So no, it is. And we're so out of balance.
Yeah.
There's so much trauma in the world. What's happening in Gaza is exemplary of it,
Mm-hmm.
and on so many levels. And what are we going to do? And I was up at University of British Columbia just before the pandemic doing a presentation, and people said, "So, Dr. Jacobs," I said, "Please call me Four Arrows." And they go, "Four Arrows. Do you think if we do look at your worldview chart, which anybody can find by just putting in worldview chart in Google, it'll come right up on a particular site where they sell posters also, but you can download it for free. Do you think we can turn things around?" They asked me, and they went from loving me to hating me in the moment that I answered, because I said, "I don't think so." And then all the hands went, "But why are you here? Why are you doing this if you don't have hope?" And I said, I did a little book called Sitting Bull's Words in a World in Crisis. And I quoted Sitting Bull. And I said, because they asked him, "How could you be so happy and so full of life and doing your songs and when all the buffalo are dead, the smallpox has wiped out most of your people. How can you?" And it was a reporter that asked him this. And he said, "Because I want to be a good human being." And so I defined hope at that meeting. I said, and I don't think this is an original, someone else, I'm sure, has said this, but hope shouldn't be the certainty of an expectation like it usually is that gets us through it. I have the hope that we're going to do this, right? I understand that. But I know a lot of people burning out who have that and then have gone and done this hard work, and then they see and they look around and go, "It's worse than it ever was," right?
Mm-hmm.
So instead, I define hope not as a certainty of a good outcome, but the certainty that whatever you're doing is the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome.
Absolutely.
And now people are saying, "You know what? I'm happier. I'm healthier. I'm not stressing out as much. I'm recognizing that I may come back to all of this in a spiritual, in another form, but I haven't slowed down my activism at all." And but at first it's a hard thing to kind of grapple with, right? And I think there's so much depression. And I mean, I even with that philosophy, when I look at democracy now and see what's going on, it's like, oh man, you can get depressed really easily until you start to say, "Wait, okay, so what can I do in my small way?" And then you start to focus on the beauty in the world. And if you remind me before we finish, on the Trail of Tears, which you and I know because we both have Cherokee heritage, women sang a song to the children every night on that brutal forced march. And the song lyrics are, "But did you see the animals in the clouds and how wonderful they are, and how they shape and shifted, and how those clouds are still keeping their responsibility and giving us water? And did you see the dancing grasses in the prairie and how they're giving food to the four-leggeds and how that helps us, and the beautiful fish in the creek we had to cross and how it's keeping the water clean, and what beautiful colors and the beautiful sounds of the mockingbird and how it teaches us to sing." These were the words that Carlos Nakai had taught me. And I'll play that melody for us when we close, maybe like a
Awesome.
going out movie, right? But just thinking about how in such a situation, a people, of course, women being the guides of that, because they have that additional wisdom we keep forgetting, us guys, but that they could have that kind of lesson for children. Hey, look, at no matter how freezing it is or what horrible things you're witnessing or who's dying, did you see the beauty that's in the world?
Yeah.
And so we have to be aware so we can do our activism, but it can't be our daily focus. Our daily focus has to be smelling the roses, that kind of a thing. No matter where you are, there's something amazing to see, even if it's the weeds growing out of the concrete sidewalk in the east side of Chicago,
That's so beautiful. I think that Yeah, in a way you're saying, like, do good for the sake of doing good, and
I like
enjoy your life, and try to. I know there's lots of noise, and there's something that I deal with every day. I think about it every day. I'm like, okay, I'm trying to do good for the sake of doing good itself, and enjoy the sunshine, enjoy the sounds of the birds. You know, go out and walk along. I live very, very close to the water. When I walk down across the water, just look over the horizon. Look how expansive that is. Look how beautiful. Take this all in. And I have to remind myself of that, because if I read anything about the news, if I look at the travesty in the world, or a lot of the work that I've been trying to do for so many years, and I feel like, not necessarily pushback, but it feels like, man, is it working? Is this worth it? What am I doing? Why did I dedicate myself to it? I'm like, no, you're dedicated to this for the sake of it. It in itself. I'm interested in, like this podcast, I'm interested in doing this podcast because I enjoy having these types of conversations. I am interested in encouraging reflection, dialogue around what does it mean to live well and to have a good life. I am, and I know that I must not be attached to the outcome, because if I'm constantly thinking about the outcome, how many followers, how many people are listening, are people doing what I'm trying to encourage with all of this? I'm like, no, don't worry about all that. You just do it for the sake of it, and find the joy in it. It's a blessing that I get to have a conversation with somebody like you, who've had life experiences that I don't have. You have wisdom to share that I don't have. So this is a blessing, just to have this experience and to be open to seeing the beauty in the experience, even though, as you and I having this conversation, there's all kinds of violence happening at the same time in the world. And it's not that we don't care. No, we do care. That's why we're having this conversation.
exactly. Well, that's
And
beautifully said, Broderick. And I think, I don't know if this adds to it, or whether intuitively you already include it, but I think that enjoying it for the sake of it, as you say, I think that brings to us at some level a sense of that's why we're here. We're
mm-hmm,
here to enjoy the beauty of what we call life, and the cycle of life and death. And so that's why we're here is one thing. But and then also, I guess if I get philosophical as an educator, I might want to put a little thing on it. I'll say, and there's a good chance that the vibrations of your enjoying what you do and what you are doing, those vibrational frequencies about how people, all these different people that you interview, there's a vibrational frequency that's not just over this recording, but it goes into the world. I think,
exactly.
I just think it does, and I think there's enough mechanic physics and quantum physics to support that. If you need to support it with so-called Western science,
Yeah.
but certainly from indigenous perspectives, and how people have survived, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a part of it also.
Exactly. I 100% agree. And we live in a field. You can talk about the mechanical world from a mechanical quantum perspective, but even just from a subjective perspective, or even in the indigenous worldview, we lived in this field, and everything we do in the field is having there are implications. So what do I do? How do I live? How am I choosing to be in this moment? Because everything that I do, there's some responsibility. And so
Well,
I
that's
feel,
one of the worldview precepts is the dominant worldview emphasizes rights, and I'm not
mm-hmm,
saying that's wrong, but it in the indigenous worldview we emphasize responsibility.
mm-hmm,
And there's a significant difference. And when you're forgetting the responsibility and just focusing on rights, things go haywire,
exactly.
and upside down. And I think I was a sports psychologist when I was teaching hypnosis for MFCC licensure at UC Berkeley, and I'm a big believer that the hypnotic phenomenon of natural hypnosis, mass hypnosis, has us forgetting who we are and leads to unhappiness in so many ways. And I used to practice hypnotherapy, and I wrote a book that just came out called that was a revision of a book that was banned in 1991 called Patient Communication for First Responders, where you would use language at the scene of a medical emergency to help people stop their bleeding or the pain of a burn, whatever. But it was banned because somebody said this should be used only in the Journal of Emergency Medicine. There was an article by an MD, PhD guy who said this should be used only by licensed physicians, not paramedics. So it was taken off the market for 20 years, just republished as a book called Hypnotic Communication in Emergency Medical Settings. But that's just the theory behind this, and it's been endorsed by the top physicians in the world now, and it's back out. But and I'm glad that I was mad about it being banned for 20 years. And I told my wife when I was editing it, I'm glad it was. I write better than I did 20 years ago. But this idea that we can be hypnotized naturally when we're in stress is the theory. During times of stress, all creatures, and if you go on YouTube and put in wild horse hypnotist, you'll see me when I was a young man doing horse whispering on a television program, bringing in a wild horse. I learned it from horses. But all creatures during times of stress become hypersuggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure. So if you think about, wow, why do I act this way? Why am I so sad? Why am I not happy? And then you realize, well, wait a minute, what happened in my life in my first 5 years when you're in constant hypnosis, or in a trauma when somebody said something that I'm believing, or what authority figure? And you go, okay, let me go back. And that's where the worldview chart analysis, it helps, right? But once you understand, that's why I'm over too much on this side, you've got to use trance-based learning, which I'm calling hypnosis, because that's a good way to define it in spite of the baggage it has, to transform. Indigenous cultures, our ancestors, yours and mine, knew this without knowing the technical kinds of terms that we're using like hypnosis. This is what ceremony is. Mm-hmm. You go to a lower brainwave frequency, you're in a dark area or you're a challenging situation, and you go into a light, state of hypnosis in which we, as Einstein said, imagination is more powerful than knowledge. We can have transformations, right? Yeah. And so they happen. And I teach it. I don't do hypnosis anymore. Somebody said, I don't do it because it works too fast and I make a lot of money, over the years doing regular analysis. I went, oh my God. So I stopped doing it and I teach it, right? And, anybody can learn it. If I tell, take a pendulum. Everybody plays with a pendulum. And when it goes, it's not something magical, really. Mm-hmm. It's the ideomotor neurons in your fingertips responding to what you're imagining is a yes or a no or this or that, right? But here's why it's useful. When you do imagine it going in a circle and it's happening, don't freak out. Don't look and say, was somebody blowing on it? Just stay with it. Like, this is a part of your brain that we call the hypnotic brain. You are in a light trance now. So if you can double task by having a predetermined, positively phrased other thing, when I go and see my dad or my mom, or when I go and see a friend, I'm going to be as joyful and feel all the good things, and I'm not going to worry about the problem that happened last night or whatever, whatever it is. Or, I'm going to see the healing of the reduction of my tumor size, right? If you have that and you can imagine that and keep this going, that's like having paid me $300 an hour in the old days, right? It's you're self-hypnotizing yourself.
Yeah.
And that kind of healing goes on all the time. I mean, just last week, a young lady who was a professor at a university where I did a conference couldn't show up because she had had 6 months ago a concussion, couldn't walk 5 steps, couldn't think. I taught her how to use the pendulum. I got a letter yesterday from her caretaker saying she's walking 4 blocks a week now. A day now. So, this is a tool that is underestimated
Mm-hmm.
and too much garbage on it, and but it works, and it can let go of the things that make you unhappy to give you the ability to reestablish a way to not be bothered by that so that your happiness can thrive.
Yeah. Wow, you're touching on so many different things here. And when I think of hypnosis, it's a state of suggestibility. So how do you get in that state of suggestibility? Rhythm. It's something that is rhythmic. Either it's this pendulum swinging or music,
Yeah, well, the
that's
pendulum, I mean,
constant.
they used to use pendulum to get hypnotized, right? But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about using it as evidence that you're in it.
Yeah,
So that,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
oh,
yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's the rhythm. It's what I'm saying, rhythm. I know people think about it as sound, but it's this continuous rhythm that you're in. You're in a state of suggestibility. And music is an important piece of that. I know it in the native tradition in here, I know in the African traditions, a lot of traditions where, you're in that, I think about African Americans, and for instance, like where I'm from in the South, small rural town. And if you go to the church and you hear the music and the singing, how do you deal with a violent world week to week? You go to church every Sunday, you go get in this hypnotic trance, and you're saying and you're singing all this positive stuff to get you through the week.
Well, but there's a problem with that too, Broderick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you're in a religious setting that is teaching you to be biased against gays, for
Yeah,
example,
for sure. Yeah.
right? That hypnosis, because you're correct that you get into hypnosis when you're in that kind of that music and that drumming and that rhythm. That's one way of putting yourself into trance. Is what we have always done as Indigenous peoples, right? It's one way we've done it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then if the message coming from that
Yep.
is, we're gonna, and it's saying it with enthusiasm, this is an example of the problems, right? So
Exactly.
that's why if we learn that we're doing this, that we're going into a setting like this, we have to make sure we got the right messages, the right directives coming.
Exactly. And that's a current issue I have with some popular music, for instance. And I think I'm like, folks, you're in a hypnotic trance and you're listening to these lyrics. Oh, the lyrics don't bother me. I'm like, what are you
No,
saying? You have no
no,
idea.
the original rap music used to be beautiful.
The original, exactly.
And then the commercial guys got it and said, we can sell a lot more if we get this down and dirty and anti-women, pro-gun, all the, and it changed, man.
Oh yeah.
And it so has the results.
Exactly. And sometimes it's hard to get people to see this. And I'm like, hypnosis is real. Being in a state of suggestibility is real. This is what our ancestors done for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. That's what's sitting around the fire and singing rhythmic songs and playing music of some sort or whatever. I mean, or swaying in the movement or do dance. You're in a suggestible state. Now, when you're in that suggestible state, what are you talking about? What are you telling yourself? What are you imagining? And you have to be mindful of it, be careful of that. And I think I'm glad you're bringing this up, because to live a good life, to living well, this is a super important piece of the puzzle, because a lot of the issues and concerns that we're seeing in the world, I feel that most people are in a hypnotic trance, and in that hypnotic trance told all kinds of crazy stuff through religious traditions, outside of religious traditions. I'm not saying, so folks, I'm not anti-religious traditions. I'm just saying some religious traditions can be used to manipulate people
Well,
and
even
create harm.
education, right?
Education, yeah.
Educational hegemony. Again, it's what my daughter's school is called, Ditch, and it's about the counter-hegemonic education. Well, the hegemony, for listeners, that's a big word, right? But it's when the ruling elite create textbooks and ideas and eliminate certain ideas and put certain ideas in, and that's redundantly given as a requirement to learn from K through 12. That they're telling us this is good for the greater good, but it's really only good for them. This is the nature of education, right? And if you go on YouTube and listen to Noam Chomsky's presentation from the University of Arizona, what are schools for? This has been historical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so religions, education, movies,
Yeah.
music, we've covered it all, right? Have the potential, positive or negative,
Yeah.
and if we're aware of it, then we can go, oh, okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to handle that now. And if it's something that you say, wow, the reason that I'm afraid of this or afraid of that, or I hate this or I hate that, is something I was taught when I was, between 1 and 5, where everything you learned is hypnotically programmed, but also it could have been some trauma, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm so, it's so cool that you get that and have been teaching that yourself, because few people get what we're saying.
I know, and I think so. It goes back to something I think is important, and I try to do for myself. I like theater, I like arts and stuff like that. But I think it's so funny, not funny, I think it's tragic that we focus so much on tragedy, and we think, oh, tragedy is how you learn how to work with your emotions and get exposure to them. I'm like, do you need to? Because I do feel like we're mostly in a hypnotic state most of the time. So do you need to expose your mind to horror movies? I'm not saying no one should do it. I'm just saying, like, think about what we're doing in a state of suggestibility and the implications of that. When we're feeding our minds with these awful things and saying that that's a great piece of art, what are we saying? I'm just posing that question. What are we saying? Do we have this? Is the tragedy necessary? I think you don't need to be creative in tragedy. The human historical experience is full of tragedy. We can talk about tragedy and talk about our experience, but do I need to suggest to myself on a regular basis debauchery and craziness
Well,
under a hypnotic trance? I
we
just
look
think,
if we look at the popular media, it's hard to find a movie or
I
anything
know
that
exactly.
isn't really doing that. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't value in exposing a big problem in the world with some kind
Absolutely.
of movie that's tragic. You look at King Leopold's Ghost, the documentary, and it's like, don't watch it more than once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's why, you mentioned repetitively, but everybody should see it once to realize the horrors of what happened in Africa.
Exactly. That's
But
one thing.
but once you got that, don't dwell on that. That's what you. So there's this fine balance, isn't there,
Exactly.
between how do you not have your head in the sand, you know, and be an activist, or make a good garden, but be aware of it so that you don't get sucked into, Donald Trump's bullshit or whatever, right? But that you really focus on, okay, I'm focusing now on the beauty. I'm focusing on
Exactly.
the garden. I'm focusing on the little girl that has these new shoes. Whatever it is, I'm focusing on how wonderful it is to watch that ant carry that leaf across my floor. Right? If that's the emphasis, then we'll start to let that, whenever the hypnosis is happening, emphasize these good things. And then
Yeah.
even when we do watch King Leopold's Ghost or whatever it is, if we recognize, wow, that could have affected my psychology, because maybe because we go in and out of hypnosis all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that was too long of many hours. I've got to now go sit down in a beautiful place, and I've got to sit
Absolutely.
under a tree, and I've got to say, okay, we know that there's bad things that have happened and are happening now. And now I thank myself for knowing that. And now I'm going to, whatever has happened to me that is depressing or traumatizing, I'm going to reverse that because I know how to do self-hypnosis, right? We have to be so conscious of this phenomenon that we can counter all these things that you rightfully say are just overwhelming us, right?
Exactly. And I think we don't have to, and in our lives, and if we want to live happy, have well being, those things that you mentioned about living a good life, living well, we have to, ultimately, what we're saying is you have to give attention to it. The more attention I give towards the good, towards the beautiful, towards these positive qualities, I'm not putting my head in the sand and denying that craziness is not happening. But I don't need to be creative coming up with crazy shit. If it's already happening, if I want to expose my mind to craziness and try to learn from it so that I don't repeat it in some capacity, study history. I don't need to create horror movies. For instance, if someone is listening to this and that's what they do, that's fine. I'm just saying, I think it's important to be mindful because I do believe we live in a field. Everything that I do, where I place my attention, is going to impact and influence my choices. And if we have a society where our attention are constantly being hijacked because we do have a negativity bias for survival reasons, we're biased towards the negative, and if we're not intentionally putting attention towards the potential positive, how do we expect things to get better? It just can't unless we are attending to it. And if we don't give attention to these things, and if we're mostly giving attention to this is a dog eat dog world, either it's me or the other person, is a zero sum game. If that's what we're giving attention to, of course, that's the culture, that's the hegemony that you're talking about. All
Mm-hmm.
of these things are going to come from that. So how do we, like you're talking about the Trail of
Well,
Tears?
how do we is to say, well, let's look at
Yeah,
our original worldview that
exactly.
disproves this dog eat dog. But then we could even get academic and say, no, let's go actually look at the descent of man and the actual book that was written, where he didn't say a word about dog eat dog or survival of the fittest, but had in the preface, Darwin I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that although I'm going to be talking about a very long-term genetic transition, the world in essence is symbiotic. And
Yes.
then, the Russian guy, Peter Kropotkin, wrote a book called Mutual Aid saying, why are all these people that have read my friend Darwin's book going out and doing this dog eat dog interpretation of what he wrote? No, the
Mm-mm.
world is symbiotic if you look at it in a broad place, and it's beautiful, and,
Yep.
and and whatever. And sure, life eats life. We're getting eaten by little microcosms right now, right?
Yeah.
And we eat carrots, or if we're a vegan or whatever, life eats life. But what we're talking about here is about the respect, the loving understanding, the gratitude,
Yes.
these kinds of dynamics of understanding the beauty of this cycle of life. Wow, we've been taught the opposite in order
Mm-hmm.
to allow for a few people to say, you're going to go to hell, or, you do this, I'll give you some food. But where we're at right now is preposterous, just
Yeah.
preposterous. It's insane.
Yeah.
Margaret Wheatley and I did a presentation at SOU the other I don't know, a month ago, I guess it was now. Time flies. But it was called Islands of Sanity. And your program, Broderick, your program, I think, is a beautiful example of what we presented. Your program is an island of sanity. and thank you for it.
Yeah, I love how I love this conversation, and there's just so many different avenues and
Yeah,
how I
we're
can.
all over the place, aren't we?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
we really
beautiful.
are. But this for me, it started. I was 15 years old, broken family, divorced, all that kind of stuff, right? And but I made my way into Europe, and I was on a train with a RAF pilot from World War II. And my dad had been in World War II, was an alcoholic, did 36 combat missions in a B-24. They got, drunk when they came back and died when he was 52. But I was on this train with another World War II guy, my dad's age. And we got to talking philosophy like you and I are. And this is what he told me, and it just stuck with me for the rest of my life. He says, well, there's probably not a panacea. I remember not knowing what that was at the time, but I didn't want to tell him. He says, there's probably not a panacea in life. But I'll tell you one thing. I think the biggest problem in our world is, and this is a quote, the inability of each and every individual to work toward expressing their full, positive mental, physical, spiritual potentiality.
Yeah.
Well, then you know how they used to have envelopes that you just kind of took, they were light and blue and they
Oh yeah, yeah,
opened
yeah.
up and that was the letter. He sent me one from London when I got back to Missouri, and it had that thing in it. That's why I remember the quote so much. And of course, by then I knew what a panacea was, but that's guided my life.
Yeah.
That's guided my life. Now, sometimes I was pathological about it. I'll admit that. Sometimes I would want someone to try something I knew they would love, like learning to play the piano or learning to swim or something. Right? And because I wanted them to work toward their positive potential, I said, come on, you can do this. And I would push too much,
Yeah.
you know,
Me.
and I realized, okay, that's coming from my own defense mechanisms of my own family, my own hypnosis. Got to do this. If you don't do this, then you're going to do the other thing. So it didn't cause me to stop pushing and stop encouraging and motivation, but I have to do it without the pathology. And then that gives a whole different tenure to it and how you go about it, right?
Yeah.
So, but that aside, that little confession aside, I think that encouraging people. Last night there was an 85-year-old friend of mine who is a very famous sculpturist, and if anybody goes to my book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, that the UC Berkeley's Science Center for the Greater Good selected as the most thought-provoking, inspiring, and practical textbook, in 2022. She had carved 8 marble statues of 8 Indian chiefs and their speeches, and then put that on prints. And we got each of those prints in the book. And it's the only way you'll be able to get to see them. But she was over at a party with me last night, and bless her heart, one of the people was a magician that used to do things with George Lucas for on kind of magic shows and stuff. And all they did was they got a glass and a like a cylindrical piece of paper and put an egg on it, and there was a cardboard paper underneath it. And then she says, "Well, I'm going to show you what I can do here." And she just pulled it, and the egg goes into the cup of water, right? So she said to my friend, "You try it." And my friend went, "Oh, no, 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 I'll fail. He's a famous artist, right? But even with her, oh, I don't. But then me with my, the life is about your working towards your highest potential, right? I did my little push, but I did it so sweetly, right? So I said, you know what? It doesn't matter. Give it a try. And of course, she did it, and it worked. And wow, you couldn't see the bigger smile on her face, right? So I think we have to help each other. Say, well, you might enjoy this, learning to square dance, or you might enjoy learning this kind of thing, and think about If you don't, and then I'll stop talking about it, maybe there's some hypnosis that is causing you to be afraid.
Yeah.
And if so, watch Broderick Rodell's program with Cuatro Flechas. They are, that's what they call me in Mexico, 4 arrows, with 4 arrows. And, 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 and you'll want to go do a little bit of self-hypnosis so you can go square dance and learn to square dance again. That's the
Awesome.
kind of thing, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about.
Exactly. I know we're getting closer to the end, but I want to ask you this question. And you've already did it. You've already mentioned it. But I would love for you to share it before we get off. So I know you've kind of outlined a lot of your past experiences of how you got in here, but can you say a little bit more? How did you get here? How did you get to see the world this way? I think that I've heard you tell this story in another context, and I would love to hear you
Well, I mean,
share with the
I think
audience.
early on there's two biggies. I'll just give you the two biggies. One of them was when I was really little, like 2, 3, 4, 5. When I saw bad things, I said to myself, I'm going to do the opposite. And that was a theme for me growing up. So when I saw really, arguments and things and bad things and alcoholism and all these kind of horrible things, I would say to myself, that's what I'm not going to do, right? And whereas a lot of people follow, I did therapy with sadists, and almost all of them had a relative that, that was abusive to them. So they couldn't, they couldn't be happy without doing the same, right? So I had that all along, but it wasn't really until I had a near-death experience on the Rio Urique River in Copper Canyon back in 1983, I think it was. I still was a tough ex-Marine Corps, officer that was angry about the Vietnam War, angry about a lot of things, and I took it out doing whitewater kayaking and that kind of thing, and wanted to be the first to ascend the Rio Urique River in Copper Canyon, a canyon deeper than the Grand Canyon that had never been done. And I was a firefighter at the time, and working with a buddy of mine who also whitewatered with me in California rivers. And so the whole river disappeared into an underground tunnel. There's a book on it called Primal Awareness that I wrote under Don Jacobs. Also, you can go on YouTube and put in the Shaman's Message, part 1, 2, and 3, 4 arrows, and you can watch. National Geographic wanted the story until they saw my pictures, which were a little Minolta. They were terrible. But I narrate that story into Copper Canyon and what I did when I came back 15 years to learn what had happened to me and why my life had changed, right? So it's called the Shaman's Message. But it did. It just was a transformation. And in the moment that I went into that hole, having time to try to paddle from not getting sucked into it, when I got sucked into it, it was the most beautiful experience that I could describe. And it wasn't until many years later I read Ray Moody's dissertation on after-death experiences, that I looked at the University of Virginia's perceptual studies on afterlife experiences, where people have described near-death experiences in the same way that I had experienced it, right? This amazing, beautiful light, this music that was so unbelievable that you couldn't, all your people that you knew being there, even enemies that are now friends, and people that were sick, now healthy. It was that kind of a thing. And I had a vision of a cat and a fawn because a mountain lion was in a cave that walked over our sleeping bags and showed us the way out as the river rose. So we had to climb out of this 8,000-foot canyon. And another Ramari Indian was carrying a baby deer that he had run down, so its feet were bleeding. And the cat and the fawn turned into letters like in New York City, neon lights. And that was concentration activated transformation, which is what you and I have been talking about. That's the hypnosis. And 4 parts of the worldview before I wrote and researched for the 40: fear, authority, words, nature, fawn, and how our original worldview is ideas on fear, authority, words, and nature is very different than our post-colonial one, and how you can put those two things together, which is what we've been talking about in a sense, right? And so that really brought me into the indigeneity, but it also got me to recognize, because I lived with the Raramuri for a while, and I saw this happiness and how they did it. And, and so, just seeing life as this beautiful, beautiful opportunity that we all have, and sharing it and being one with one another, and recognizing our oppositions. There's a guy named Walter Block, who's an endowed professor at Loyola, who I've disagreed with everything he's ever written. He's libertarian. I called him up and said, look, I want to write a book. I already got a title, Differing Worldviews. 2 scholars argue cooperatively about justice education in universities. Would you write it with me? Because I disagree with you, and I know you disagree with me. So we wrote it, and it's published. And Walter and I became friends, strange bedfellows that we are. And now, not everybody agrees. I gave a copy of it to Alice Walker, who's color purple, and she's a friend of mine, a neighbor in Mexico. And she looked through it and threw it in the waste can. And it endorsed to her and everything, autographed for her. I thought she'd be, like that I had done that. She says, you're in bed with the devil. So I don't agree with Alice on that one.
No.
But when we did a book signing, again, people can watch this on YouTube, going to St. Louis University, Dewar Social Justice Center, and watch us present. And he was a better writer than I am. He has a good sense of humor, a good presenter. But it was cool because when we did the book signing, the people that were his fans, which he had more than me in St. Louis, would come up to me and say things like, well, for a liberal, you're not bad, or something like that, And then my fans, would go up to him and say, Dr. Block, I sure disagree with you believing only humans have intrinsic value and that everything else on earth is utilitarian for people. I can't tell you how much I disagree with that. But thank you. Thank you for working with us, for the compromises the two of you have done, for your being here. And this was at a time when the polarities were, right like they are now, right?
Yeah.
Not too long ago. And so I think we can do this.
Yes.
We can do this, brother.
Yes. God, that's so beautiful. I'm so happy you brought that up. And near the end of this podcast, man, I can talk to you forever. And I hope to continue to do that in some
We'll do another
capacity.
one next year.
Yeah, let's do this again. And I really appreciate you and your passion. I feel it. I hope the audience feels it. I know those of you who listen to this by just audio, I encourage you to look at the video because you just got to see the passion in the conversation that we're having. And yeah, that was just beautiful. I think it's so appropriate for the things that are happening right now that we can do this. We can have these conversations and we may all disagree. I'm sure you and I disagree on things, but we look at the love that is created in this conversation. It's an example of what you were saying earlier about what do we place our attention on? We're placing our attention on connecting with each other, listening to each other. What do we have in common? What's beautiful about what 4 Hours is saying? I'm so interested. I'm fascinated by his story. We can do that, everyone. And I hope that we can do this more. I hope we can feel like, at least me, I feel like I'm different after this conversation.
And I do too, Broderick. I do too, because it was the dynamic of our interconnectedness, of our dance, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I've just left the dance floor.
I know, right? Oh, you give such beautiful analogies. I'm loving it. One thing I like to ask at the very end is Is there anything you like to leave the audience with? I know that was great, but is there anything else you would like to leave the
Well,
audience with
maybe
in that song?
let's
Maybe.
we could do a little mystery here, I guess, maybe, and allow people to feel just the vibrations, because I'll offer a closing prayer in Lakota.
So can you do that? And also, I know you mentioned earlier about
Okay,
the song.
I'll do the closing prayer, and people will be able to say that this is a prayer all about what we're talking about. It's
Mm-hmm.
all just about walking on this difficult road of the red road of balance. It's about recognizing the beauty in everything, the sentience in everything, and it's about gratitude giving, right?
Mm-hmm.
Giving thanks, as often as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll say that, and then I'll fade out with the song that they sang on the Trail of Tears to remember to see the beauty all around.
Yes, beautiful.
Otunkashila wakantanka mamakompo na tetewa topa unshimaka ahituayam kelo. O yate oya sin chanku luz ochnamani oichakiapo. O yate oya sin unchi wichalapuna oichakiapo. Hecho wicho zari washte uniwa bigdelo. Ihani lako wicho haki tunkashi the kiksuye. Metako ye oyasi. Metako yasa.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.